Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I do hope that you're not living in the California area where you might be subjected to some of those wildfires. And if you are from California, I just hope that your house is in one piece and that you keep very strong, because it's terrible when things like that happen and the winds get so wild and the fires erupt all over the place. It's just awful. Lots of love to everybody, and go and get yourself something lovely to drink because you're about to hear a fabulous story. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. The year was 1984. And 10-year-old Edward Barry stared out of his bedroom window, completely lost in his own thoughts, as the rain bucketed down. There was something extremely soothing about the rain pelting against the roof. It calmed down the hunger pangs that were building up inside his stomach, to such an awful extent that he was dreaming of crispy fish fingers and French fries. And the more he salivated about such a mouth-watering delicious meal, the more his stomach began to cramp up. He realized he was drooling. Edward had never known hunger like this before. He felt as if his insides were eating themselves up alive. His hunger was insatiable. Edward had told his mother he was hungry at lunchtime, after he'd been dropped home from school by their kind neighbour, Mrs. Weinstein. Edward's mother, Julia Barry, was distracted by her two screaming 6-month-old twins that she had snapped at Edward furiously and told him to go straight to his bedroom. Well, actually, it would seem she had screamed at him so hysterically, to such an extent that Edward had jumped out of his skin, from the shock of his mother's angry retort. Edward had never known his mother to become so outraged. Her nostrils had flared, her lips had curled up into the ugliest scowl that he had ever seen, and for a brief second he was sure her eyes had gone completely white, so that his mother looked as if she was demon-possessed. Things had been so incredibly different in the Barry household before the fortuitous arrival of the twins, and back in those days things had been very good, for Edward's mother Julia had lavished an extortionate amount of attention on her beloved 10-year-old son. Indeed, back then, not a single day had passed by when Julia Barry hadn't tucked Edward up in bed lovingly and told him how much she adored him. She would read him a thrilling bedtime story every single night. Those nostalgically delightful days seemed like a wistful passing memory, for there had been laughter and merriment in the Barry household. Indeed, back then, not a day had passed Edward by when his mother, Julia Barry, hadn't devotedly tucked Edward up in bed and told him how much she loved him and read him a thrilling bedtime story. Those nostalgic, delightful days seemed like a wistful passing memory, for there had been so much laughter and merriment in the Barry household. Indeed, Edward had been so deliriously happy, but looking back, he only began to appreciate how good things really had been then. So he could not help but harbour a growing sense of resentment towards his two 6-month-old twin sisters, Georgia and Eleanor, as once they had come along, things had never been the same again. But little Edward knew he couldn't blame his sisters for his mother's cantankerous attitude these days. Edward's father, Wayne, seemed to dread returning home on an evening, and even when he parked his car in the driveway, he'd often sit there for ages staring into space, as if bracing himself to actually come indoors, like someone who is very reluctant to jump in the ocean in case they get eaten alive by the sharks. Gone was the warm, devoted, cheery smile on Wayne Barry's face when he entered the house, barely even acknowledging or greeting his own wife. Instead, he would mutter a half-hearted hello, and would hurriedly retreat to his study, where he'd seek refuge and would lock the door quietly behind him, something he'd never been privy to doing before. The only time he'd make a somewhat beleaguered appearance was when hunger finally got the better of him, or when he decided to look in on the twins, or to seek Edward out to see how he was doing. But he did his level best to avoid his wife as much as he possibly could, so they soon became like two passing ships in the night, for they had very little contact with each other. Wayne Barry would often spend the night in the spare bedroom, claiming he didn't want to disturb his wife, for she needed her beauty sleep. Wayne Barry's increasive evasive behaviour towards his wife Julia got progressively worse, and only served to heighten and exacerbate the unrelentless arguments in the Barry household that had become increasingly more fiery. Edward's mother was always tirelessly complaining to Wayne that he was never there for the family, and on 2 separate occasions she had practically accused him of having an affair with his secretary at the office in town, which would have been strange and rather unorthodox, for the woman in question was old enough to be Wayne's mother. But that didn't appear to stop Julia from accusing her husband of treacherously indecent behaviour, which Wayne Barry had adamantly denied. "I know you're having an affair with Sonia Ewing," she would say, spitting at her husband contemptuously, to which Wayne would almost laugh and say, "Don't be ridiculous, love. Where on earth did you get that insane idea from? My secretary is old enough to be my mother. She has purple hair, wears tortoiseshell glasses, and if I had to have an affair with someone, it wouldn't be her. I'm not attracted to purple hair, or to women that could have actually given birth to me." "It's all in your head, love," he would say, lashing out at her in return. "Why do you think so badly of my character? I'm a man of integrity, that sticks to his marriage vows. Surely you know that I wouldn't cheat on you, Julia." Julia would respond defiantly, with hands on hips, and she'd glare at her husband with indignant daggers for eyes that became almost reptilian. They looked as if they could pierce through bone, marrow and sinew, for they became almost menacing. "All right," said Wayne Barry, raising a hand to appease his wife. "I'll level with you, Julia. Can you blame me for not wanting to come home? If you want to know the bitter truth, I'll spell it out to you plainly. I dread coming home to you. That's why I'll often sit in the car and read a newspaper, because it takes me a lot of energy to pluck up the courage to get into the house. If the truth be told, love, I feel as if I'm sharing a house with a temperamental female grizzly bear that is always volatile and unpredictable, and is usually in a cantankerously pugnacious mood, and is eager to launch an attack on me the moment I walk through the front door. Let's just say if I say anything that rubs you up in the wrong way, anything that upsets you, oh boy, do I know about it. I feel as if I'm walking on eggshells with you, love, these days. Nothing I ever do is right, nor is it good enough. Ever since the twins have come along, you've changed exponentially in more ways than I can ever count. You're not the person you used to be, and I want that wonderful woman back that I idolized so much. Where did she go?" Julia Barry had been furious at her husband's candid retort. She had launched an attack at him like a rabid dog, foaming at the mouth. She had unabashedly slapped her husband across the face, something she'd have never dreamed of doing before. And when Wayne Barry had been hit, his eyes had widened in disbelief, because these days he genuinely did not recognize the woman he loved so much. Indeed, he didn't even like Julia anymore, but he kept these thoughts privately to himself. Julia's 2 best friends, Angie and Lisa, who would visit her on Tuesdays and Fridays for tea, never returned to the house again, which in itself was decidedly odd, for Julia had been very close to her 2 girlfriends, and Wayne Barry noticed even they appeared to have distanced themselves from her. So he knew very well he wasn't imagining the startling changes he had seen in his wife's personality, for other people seemed to feel it too. Julia would spend countless hours on the phone talking to her sister Natalie, her mother Ruby, and of course her 2 best friends. But these days the phone never rang in the Barry household, for no one appeared to want to speak to Julia anymore. Even at 10 years old, Barry had to agree with his father on this one. Something was seriously wrong with his mother. Even on a recent dental appointment, where Edward had accompanied his mother to the surgery and sat waiting for her patiently in reception, he had been visibly disturbed to learn that his mother's dentist, Dr. Greenberg, whom she'd been seeing since she was a little girl, had thrown her out of his surgery and told her never to come back again and to find for herself another dentist. "The man is pathetic," Julia Barry had complained in the car on the way back home. "I can't believe he had the audacity to throw me out of his surgery like that." But the dentist's grandson, a boy called Errol Greenberg, who happened to be in Edward's class at school and was good friends with Edward, had confided in him that his mother, Julia Barry, had growled at his grandfather like a vicious, very dangerous dog when he'd worked on her teeth, and then suddenly he'd bitten one of his fingers so hard when he'd tried to investigate the decay between two of her teeth that he'd bled quite badly and had gone off to the hospital not only to have stitches but a tetanus shot as well. This revelation had naturally horrified little Edward. His mother was slapping his father across the cheeks, biting the dentist, and become estranged from her friends. What would his mother do next, he wondered. It would seem Julia Barry was quickly turning people against her, left, right and centre, including Edward himself, of course, and his father, Wayne Barry. 10-year-old Edward had grown increasingly afraid of his mother of late, especially when her eyes would suddenly become cloudy and white, a look he'd seen on a woman called Zara Witchen, who had visited their house once for tea, and it had scared the bejesus out of him. Now he was seeing the same look on his mother. In the old days, she had been a sweet, nurturing, kind spirit, but now Julia Barry was volatile and as combustible as Mount Etna in Italy, for anything would set her off into a fiery tangent of indignant rage that was almost unquenchable, rather like a Californian wildfire that you couldn't easily put out. It didn't help, of course, that the Barry household was never peaceful or serene these days, for ostensibly Edward's two twin sisters would scream tirelessly. Julia Barry tried to comfort them, but they'd wail all the more, as if they themselves were affronted by their own mother's demeanour, for she seemed to scare them as much as she was scaring little Edward these days. Julia Barry had turned on her husband Wayne, after he'd told her some unsavoury truths about how she had changed of late. She reared up at him like a contemptuous viper. Her brown eyes became distinctly yellow, like that of a reptile. Even the way she moved her body reminded little Edward of a snake. "You think I've changed, do you?" said Julia, as she addressed her husband, with eyes blazing incandescently. "You would change if you were trapped in a house like this day after day, with a multitude of chores to do, as well as looking after 3 very demanding children. Do you have any idea how hard I work looking after 2 babies and 1 10-year-old? The twins cry all the time, non-stop, demanding my undivided attention. Edward is always wanting to be fed, almost as if he's got a bottomless pit for a stomach. I'm permanently exhausted, Wayne, but you have no comprehension what it's like for me to be a full-time mother. It's all right for you, Wayne. You have it so damn easy, don't you? You go off to your cushy job in the city, where you're insulated from the demands of daily life here at home. You don't have to concern yourself with dirty diapers and the screams of 2 babies. It's absolutely exhausting and very debilitating looking after both the twins. I feel as if I'm on a merry-go-round all the time. They won't stop crying, but you never lift a finger to help around the place. You were the one that wanted these babies, but now I'm the sole carer for the both of them. For you just bugger off, and when you come home, you storm off to your study, locking the door behind you, and I don't see you until you want something to eat." "Love," said Wayne Barry, "this is not about the twins. You know it. You're right. I should help you around the house more, but I don't like interacting with you these days. We always end up fighting. I'm a pacifist. I hate arguing. You just changed, love. A light has gone off in you. You're not the person I married. That's all I'm saying." Edward's parents' arguing voices would go on, and their angry flare-ups would beat against the Barry house, louder than the raindrops that were currently pounding against the roof. There were times that their fighting would be so intense that Edward would block out their voices by placing his hands over his ears. He didn't want to listen to them arguing again and again, and fighting like a couple of angry Rottweilers that were going for each other's jugulars. Edward could barely recognize his life anymore, for everything had changed exponentially in the Barry household, and not in a good way. Edward could sense a tangible, very clandestine darkness was spreading over the household like a festering mold that was draining the air of all the oxygen and filling the house with an oppressive, profound sense of heaviness. He was sure his twin sisters could feel it too, which would explain why they cried all the time. Up until the twins were born, Edward's father, Wayne Barry, had been devoted and really loving towards his wife and, of course, his son Edward. There had been no doubt in young Edward's mind that for the first 10 years of his life, his father had absolutely adored his mother, idolizing her, like some people might put their favourite film star on a pedestal. Even Julia Barry's own friends envied the relationship that she had with her husband, claiming that she had found for herself in Wayne a keeper, because the man adored her so very much. In those fun-loving, carefree years, Edward's father Wayne had remained smitten over his wife, declaring himself to be the luckiest man in the entire world. He'd always tell little Edward how he had hit the jackpot in marrying his mother, and how blessed they were to have each other. But nowadays the sullen, very sombre, heavy mood in the Barry household could not have been more tense, for it had been contaminated by a sense of growing disquiet, almost as if an unforeseen darkness had been slowly but surely creeping across the household and very ambiguously sucking away the serenity that had once been so much a part of Edward's young life. Where had all the joy gone to, Edward wondered to himself, for he had not seen his parents dote on each other for a long time, as they once had done so. These days he might as well be a fly buzzing around on the window-sill, as the only time his mother ever appeared to notice him was when she wanted to swat him away, and she was increasingly forgetting to feed him, so that young Edward was dropping so much weight that even some of the teachers at his school had expressed their alarm. One had actually phoned Julia Barry, who had told the teachers that of course Edward was eating, and no, nothing was wrong with her son. Edward tried to think when the trouble had first begun, and when things had turned sour like milk in the refrigerator that suddenly goes off and begins to curdle and doesn't smell too great. It all started when his mother Julia had announced to her husband Wayne and to Edward that she was pregnant. The news had made Barry's father very ecstatic. Indeed, Edward had never seen his father look so animated before when he was told this life-changing news, for the Barry family had always wanted to be a big one. Wayne's eyes had lit up like a Christmas tree, and his expression had become one of wondrous awe, as he looked at his wife adoringly, almost as if she was some kind of angel of light that had answered one of his biggest, most important wishes. "You're having twins? This is the best news ever, love. I can't believe you're pregnant, Julia. This is a wish that we've always wanted for ourselves. We thought... "I know what we thought," Julia Barry had said excitedly. She reached out to affectionately stroke Wayne's day-old shadow on his chin with her long fingers, staring adoringly into his eyes. "We thought I could never have any more children, didn't we? I mean, we've been trying for the last 10 years or so to be able to have a brother or sister for little Edward over here. And then I get pregnant like this, just like magic, with a little tweak here and there. It looks like a miracle has erupted in our lives, Wayne, and I, for one, could not be happier. As you know, I've wanted children as much as you have. We've always wanted a big family." "It's a miracle," said Wayne Barry, his voice alive with a pronounced cheer. "Did you hear that, young Edward?" said his father, turning around to look at little Edward, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a toy truck tucked away in his hands. He had been listening to his parents' conversation, with an expression of bewilderment on his face, as he was trying his level best to digest the startling news of what he'd just heard. His mother was having a baby, and Edward wasn't sure how he felt about this, for he knew their introduction into his life would bring about many changes, and he wasn't sure about change. He liked things just as they were, him, his mother, and his father against the world. But now, in the not-too-distant future, there would be another family member. "You're about to have a little brother or sister, Edward. Did you hear what your mother was just telling me?" said Wayne Barry exuberantly. "Your mother is pregnant. Isn't that exciting? I know how you've always wanted a sibling, and now your dream has been answered, as has ours." Edward had not known exactly how to react to this earth-shattering news. At 10 years old, he liked being the centre of his parents' world, and now that attention would be divided, with him and another sibling, rather like a packet of candies, and he wasn't sure how he felt about this. He had become used to being an only child. Now he knew that there would be significant changes on the horizon of his life, And little Edward didn't like the taste of change, for it invited in him a feeling of uncertainty that he simply could not shake off. Maybe even in that poignant moment of time, Edward had a sense of knowing that from thenceforth his life would never ever be the same again. When Edward was between the ages of 3 and 5, he had certainly expressed a desire to have siblings, but now with the baby's ominous arrival on the horizon of his life, he knew things would be profoundly different. For a start, there would be a noticeable 10-year age gap between him and his sibling, so he doubted that they would have much in common. It was true he'd always wanted a sibling, but later when his mother had announced that she was expecting 2 twin girls, that was a bit of a bummer for Edward. He couldn't help but feel a tad disappointed. He would have liked very much for one of the twins to have been born a boy, even with a noticeable age gap between them, for they would still have had something in common. And he could have taught his brother many things. He might have enjoyed the part of being a big brother. But girls were a different kettle of fish altogether. Edward believed girls were sissies who loved to play dress-up with their mother's clothing and walk around with dolls in their arms, and never really getting their hands dirty. On the day his mother had announced she was pregnant, Edward had no way of knowing back then that she was carrying twin girls. He had managed a half-hearted smile that didn't meet his young, curious brown eyes. For a moment he'd stood there stoically in the doorway, his toy truck almost slipping out of his hands, almost as if his fingers were smothered in butter. For a brief moment he watched his ebullient parents dancing across the kitchen floor excitedly, doing all kinds of rather exotic dance moves, as they were so lost in each other and in that treasured moment of having their dreams now fully realized. "Mrs. Julia Barry," his father had said, throwing his arms around his wife lovingly, "what did I ever do to deserve the likes of you? I'm the luckiest man in the entire world to have you as a wife," his father had said, looking at his wife adoringly, as if there was no one in the entire universe that could measure up to her. And in that moment Edward believed he meant every word of it. Edward had shuddered, watching his parents in disgust because they were behaving all lovey-dovey. It had made him feel extremely uncomfortable, but now he longed for those days when his parents would tease each other shamelessly and giggle among themselves like a couple of loved-up teenagers. But those preciously nostalgic days from the past were now long gone. "I'm glad you know a good thing when you see it," Julia Barry had teased her husband, suddenly turning around to acknowledge little Edward, almost as if suddenly remembering he was standing in the doorway. She had given him a wink and giggled. "What do you think, Edward?" she'd asked him contentedly, rubbing her flat stomach. "Soon your mother's going to be enormous. I'm going to look like a beached whale, aren't I? What do you think about that, Edward? You're about to have a little brother or sister. What do you think?" Edward did not answer his mother. His eyes widened. He walked out of the kitchen and away from them. He could hear his mother say, "What's all that about? You'd think little Edward would be happy that he's having a little brother or sister. For years he used to ask about having a sibling. But now he's very quiet, isn't he?" Edward could hear his mother's voice sound almost disappointed and somewhat disheartened, but he didn't care about that. He needed to think about this earth-shattering news that he knew would ultimately change his life forever. "Leave him be, love," came his father's reassuring voice. "Kids, you know what they're like. Sometimes they need to adjust to a bombshell like this. I'm sure he'll come around to the idea that you're having a baby, and that he's going to have a brother or sister. You must remember, there will be a sizable age gap between him and his sibling, and that's quite difficult to deal with." "Well, I hadn't thought of it quite like that," said Julia Barry. "I really wish so much I'd fallen pregnant a year after Edward was born. But we tried so much to make that happen, and it just wasn't to be. It would have been so much better if our children were closer in age. That would be an ideal situation. You are right, it's going to be an adjustment for poor little Edward. But I'm sure after a while he'll be as proud as Punch to have a sibling." "Julia Barry, I don't want to see any hangdog expressions on your face, nor do I want you to be sad. We are celebrating the best news ever. We're about to be parents again. We thought you couldn't have another child, and now you're pregnant again. I, for one, could not be happier." As young Edward soulfully reflected about the significant changes he'd seen in his mother, he realized they'd all happened, even before she fell pregnant with the twins. In fact, Edward could pinpoint the day exactly when all this had happened. His mother had invited her two girlfriends, Angie and Lisa, around for tea, along with a strange, rather unorthodox woman called Zara Witchen, whom Edward instinctively disliked from the very second she'd entered their kitchen, for there was something sinister about Zara Witchen that had made Edward physically squirm. Edward's mother always invited Angie and Lisa for tea twice a week. It had become a regular routine for her, and little Edward had learnt to very politely make himself scarce by sitting on the floor in the far corner of the kitchen, so as not to disturb the adults as they talked together. He would spend this time playing with his dinky toys, cars or soldiers, and the games were so absorbing for him that he often forgot his mother and her two best girlfriends were even there, for he had grown accustomed to their presence. And to Julia Barry, both Angie and Lisa were more like sisters to her than just good friends, for the three of them were extremely close. Angie was also Edward's godmother. In the background, Edward would always hear the drone of his mother's friends' cheerful, chatty voices, along with the rattle of cutlery and the sound of tea being poured, along with the clank of teacups as they were placed back on their saucers. On this occasion, Zara Witchen had entered the kitchen, and Edward had looked up from the far corner, where he was amusing himself playing with his dinky toys. He stared up at the strange woman, his mouth dropping open. He had never seen her a day before in his life, and this woman, whoever she was, had drawn his undivided attention. He noticed that the moment Zara entered the kitchen, everything had gone extremely cold, almost as if the entire warm kitchen was now flooded with icy cold air that was extremely palpable. But none of the ladies had noticed any of this, although, to be fair, Edward's mother had suddenly expressed a keen interest to put on a cardigan. When Zara had glanced over at Edward, sitting there on the floor playing with his dinky toys, she had given him a menacious, almost devilish grin, with a perfect set of pearly white teeth that made Edward's skin visibly crawl. Edward had hurriedly looked away from the woman, as her piercing dark gaze seemed to drill right through him, and there had been a faraway look in her eyes that had scared the living bejesus out of him, and for a second, while she'd looked at him, her eyes had gone a cloudy white colour, which had given Edward the chills. Edward had tried his level best to remain anchored to the kitchen floor, as his mother expected him to behave himself and to always do his bidding, when all he wanted to do was run as fast as he could to his bedroom and hide under the mattress from this scary, intimidating woman. And to think that he would worry at night, during the lonely, long, sequestered hours, that there was a monster under his bed, when there was one in the kitchen right now, a real live monster. This was one that disguised as a woman, but there was something nefarious about her. This woman was enjoying tea with his mother and her two girlfriends, and yet they failed to see that the woman that they were entertaining was barely human. "So who do we have here?" said Zara Witchen, walking over towards Edward. He had focused his undivided attention on the dinky car he was playing with on the floor, pretending to be fully absorbed with it. He didn't want to look up at this awful woman, because as she drew closer and closer to him, the hair on Edward's back stood up on end. No one had creeped little Edward out like this woman before. Looking back as Edward did, as soberly as he could, it was definitely after the likes of Zara Witchen, when she'd entered the kitchen that day, to join his mother and her two best friends for tea, that Edward's world as he had known it had gone badly awry. In the very beginning, the changes had been so subtle, so much so that they were barely discernible. But during the course of Julia Barry's pregnancy, she became increasingly erratic, cranky, throwing things around the house belligerently, for no rhyme or reason at all. She had become unreasonably demanding, aggressively volatile, and somewhat unhinged, so much so that her uncharacteristic behaviour had often served to alarm little Edward, who had not been able to comprehend the dramatic changes he had observed in his mother's personality. Edward would have thought that now his mother was carrying twins, she would be increasingly happy these days, for her dream had been fulfilled. But it would seem the bigger Julia became, the more obnoxious and decidedly spiteful her personality. In the latter weeks of her pregnancy, Julia Barry would eat huge bowlfuls of pickles and ice cream, for her appetite for sweet and tart became almost insatiable. Wayne Barry, seeing how visibly upset and aggrieved Edward had become about his mother's capricious attitude towards him, had discreetly taken his son aside, when his mother had lashed out at him unscrupulously and told him to get the hell away from her. Wayne Barry had put his arms affectionately around his son. "Look, Edward, I know your mother is always cranky these days, and getting easily upset about everything and nothing, but we can't take this personally. I know that I don't. You can't afford to get upset. When a woman is pregnant, there's hormones raging all around the place, well, all over the body, it would seem, causing absolute mayhem. And that is what's going on with your mother, I'm afraid, causing her to become very bad-tempered. So even if she's horrible to you, don't let it upset you. Once the babies are born, she'll be back to herself again. I can assure you of that." "But she's always horrible, Daddy," Edward had said. "She says mean things to me. She always tells me to go away. And when I tell her I'm hungry, she tells me to shut up and to leave her well alone." Wayne Barry had rubbed his hands through Edward's curly brown hair, roughing it up a little, something he did by way of affection, but Edward found it a tad annoying, for his father succeeded in messing up his hair so that it stood up on end like a hedgehog's spikes. "I know, son. It's not easy, any of this, especially not putting up with your mother's pugnacious outbursts. But you're a big boy now, are you not? We can both brave this tumultuous storm together, and there will be a light at the end of the tunnel. But you must remember, as I keep saying to you, your mother is carrying around 2 babies in that stomach of hers, so she's having a much harder time than your average pregnant woman, who only carries around 1 baby. Think about it, son. Your poor mother's having a very, very hard time. Imagine how grumpy you would feel if your feet were always swollen, if you felt nausea and morning sickness every morning, with an urgent need to throw up. Your mother needs plenty of rest. But I promise you this, son. Once the babies are born, she'll be herself again, as I keep saying." That, of course, had been wishful thinking on Wayne Barry's part, because his wife Julia really had undergone an extraordinary metamorphosis, but not the good kind, I'm afraid. Julia Barry was becoming more objectionable, increasingly irritable and aggressive, especially after the twins were born. She didn't seem like a woman who was delighted to become a mother, but on the contrary seemed to despise and resent her role, as if it was something that had been forcefully thrust upon her. Julia had always been attractive, a woman with a rosy glow that made people naturally warm to her, but these days her personality seemed somewhat disingenuous. She had always been popular with her friends, but after the twins were born, her Machiavellian, seemingly sly behaviour had turned her nearest and dearest against her, almost as if they regarded her as an enemy rather than a friend, for wherever she went, she could not resist being rude and offensive towards people. "Oh, what a lovely boy!" Zara Witchin had cooed, as she stood over little Edward that indelible day, in the kitchen, rather like a vulture over its youngling. "Such an angelic face you do have, young man," she told Edward. "I love your ash-brown hair, and your lovely eyes." She turned to look directly at Julia. "He's the picture of innocence, isn't he? I take it he's your son." "That would be right. His name is Edward," Julia had said with humour in her voice. "He may look like an angel, but don't be fooled for a second, Zara, by those adorable dimples on both of his cheeks. Believe me, my son has his moments. When angelic, he most certainly is not. I'm afraid he can be very shy with strangers." So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.